Due to the graphic nature of this urban legend, listener discretion is advised. This episode includes depictions of body horror, self-harm, drug use and addiction, and the use of tobacco products, as well as discussions of suicide, addiction, and self-harm. We advise extreme caution for children under 13. Dealing with death is always hard. You try to make sense of it, picking up the pieces, the remnants of your loved one left behind. Papers, mementos, every little thing. A chipped coffee mug, an old band t-shirt, a half-empty pack of cigarettes, one turned upside down inside for luck. You don't smoke, so you leave it and the small white Bic lighter on the coffee table. You box up the important things and donate the rest. At the end of the day, you pass the coffee table again. It seems wasteful to throw away a whole pack, but you also don't know anyone who smokes. Still, you put the cigarettes and the lighter in your pocket, on the lookout for someone taking a smoke break on the street. You find them a few days later on your way back from your local coffee shop. You offer the pack and the lighter. They accept gladly, and you go on your way. But as you cross the street, you feel a strange weight in your pocket. You reach in and draw it out. It's the white lighter. Puzzled, you examine it more closely, your pace slowing as you near the other side of the street. You don't see the car until it slams straight through you. The lighter flies from your hand, clattering to the sidewalk. A few hours later, a too-cool-for-school teenager will pick it up, using it to light up their third cigarette of the day. She will die too, and the next, and the next. All this string of victims will have in common is a little white lighter. Welcome to Haunted Places, a Parcast original. I'm Greg Polson. Today's episode is part of our Urban Legends series. Every Tuesday, we explore those chilling stories you hear secondhand, the kind that seem made up, but contain a kernel of truth. Urban Legends is only on Spotify, so keep listening here to never miss an episode. But don't forget to come back each Thursday for a classic episode of Haunted Places, covering yet another ghost-filled locale. You can find episodes of Haunted Places and all of the Parcast originals for free on Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. To stream Haunted Places for free on Spotify, just open the app and type Haunted Places in the search bar. At Parcast, we're grateful for you, our listeners. You allow us to do what we love. Let us know how we're doing. Reach out on Facebook and Instagram at Parcast and Twitter at Parcast Network. Today, we examine an urban legend that has earned a unique place in music industry lore, thanks to the tragic deaths of the 27 Club, an ever-growing group of artists who tragically passed away at the age of 27. The club's most prominent members, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, and Kurt Cobain, are said to have had white lighters on their person at the time of their death. These four notable members of the 27 Club were all addicts, talented artists living hard in a fast-paced music scene that often enabled their most self-destructive impulses. So it's entirely possible that they all just happened to have lighters on them because they smoked a lot of different substances. Regardless, conspiracy theories have always swirled around the death of counterculture luminaries like Joplin and Cobain, and the lighter offers a compelling supernatural twist. A twist that suggests perhaps the killer was fate itself, using a cursed object to balance the world in the cruelest way possible. There's nothing you can do to stop it. The story reiterates. Once you've lit a cigarette with a pale white plastic in your hand, you're marked for death. Why, knowing the superstition, would you risk it? Why does any addict make such a choice? Are these actions compulsive? If so, how can we help? Or Is it beyond our power? The starter house was meant to be a new beginning. New town, new life, new friends. More distractions, less temptation. Franny had been gentle but firm when she told Nora they were moving. There was no negotiation. Suburbia was not Nora's style. The wisteria bushes and bleached white siding made her black leather jacket and pink highlights look like she was trying too hard. Maybe she was. But she didn't want anyone to know that. She didn't want anyone to know why they were here, what they had escaped, what they would always be running from. The entire house smelled of ash. Some of the walls had been torn through by a roaring blaze. The carpet was singed in places. Jagged stripes of wallpaper climbed up the interior of the house like vines. But it was all they could afford in the neighborhood Franny wanted. Walkable, good schools, far enough away from the train station that going to the city would require motivation. Temptation removed. The real estate broker told the women that there had been one casualty in the building, but it was nothing to be worried about. This was New York. He was legally obligated to disclose if the place was haunted. Nora didn't like it, but she had no room to argue. Franny clearly loved the place, her eyes lighting up with possibility as she wandered through the burnt-out rooms. She wanted to heal the home, whatever that meant. They signed all the paperwork and waited a few months to take possession of the house. Franny carried Nora over the threshold. They sat for a moment, appreciating everything. They were alive, against all odds, against all vices, and they were together. Next, they would begin the healing by completing the house's destruction. They ripped up the carpet and slammed sledgehammers through fragments of non-weight-bearing walls. Plaster rained down like falling snow. They slept in sleeping bags upstairs, in one relatively undamaged room. Nora struggled to close her eyes. Several times throughout the night, she heard the telltale scraping of small feet in the walls. Raccoons or squirrels burrowing through the flimsy insulation to make a home for themselves. She tossed and turned, unable to settle between the sound and the moonlight from the curtainless windows. In a different time, all this energy had an easy solution: a lit match, powder in a bag. Gritting her teeth, Nora pushed the thought away. She turned to look over at Franny, studying the lines of her face, remembering the wear and tear they'd wrought on each other. When dawn finally broke, Nora rolled up her sleeping bag to find an odd remnant of the previous owners. A white lighter had found its way underneath her in the night. It hadn't been there when she put her sleeping bag down, but she could feel the small sore spot where it had pressed against her back. Nora asked Franny if the lighter belonged to her. Franny had never seen it before. She joked that maybe it was a house-warming gift, laughing at her own pun. To Nora, giving a lighter as a gift when the house had burned down was tasteless. Maybe their agent had a bad sense of humor. Franny nodded solemnly, saying she wouldn't be surprised. But waste not, want not. She slid the lighter into Nora's pocket with a smile. Then they made breakfast together and went back to work. Nora peeled wallpaper until her hands were red. Her fingers ached, and there was dust in her throat. She grabbed a cold bottle of water from the fridge and stepped outside for a much-needed smoke break. The hot air hit her skin almost immediately, causing a fresh layer of sweat to rise on her face. She downed the water greedily and sat on the stoop, unlit cigarette dangling from her hand. It was the last bad habit to break. Franny had told her she didn't care, as long as it kept the other demons at bay. A round, gray-haired man was hanging around the fence. He introduced himself as Rick. Nora feared she was going to have to explain that she and Franny weren't just friends, and that they weren't trying to bother anyone. But that didn't wind up being necessary. Rick wanted to teach his new neighbors how to barbecue. Listening politely, Nora brought the cigarette to her lips, asking if he minded her smoking while they talked. He shook his head. She pulled the white lighter out of her pocket. Rick's face went as pale as the plastic casing. She stopped, waiting for an explanation. He shook himself, finally seeming to return to reality. He gulped and told her using the lighter would usher in her death. She raised an eyebrow at him, unimpressed. He started to tap his foot against the pavement and told her everything he knew. Several famous people had died after using a white lighter. Rock stars mostly. Morrison, Cobain, Joplin, Hendrix. But normal people too. There were pictures all over the internet that confirmed it. The lighter was an ill omen. Use it, and death would follow. He nodded over to her partially burned-out house, as if that proved his point. Nora found herself getting offended on the home's behalf. She lowered the lighter, rolling the useless cigarette between her fingers. She didn't believe Rick, but she wanted to make a good first impression with her neighbor. This was the one inconvenient thing about homeownership. You were stuck living next to the same people for the foreseeable future. They talked for a few more minutes before Nora made an excuse to go back inside. She left the white lighter on the kitchen counter and lit her cigarette on the gas stovetop, feeling silly as she did it. She paced the well-worn carpet, thinking about who had lived here before. She hadn't had the nerve to look for the gory details in her new home's history, but now it was bothering her. She typed the street address into the search bar and watched as the results loaded. She immediately regretted this decision. A teenage boy had burned alive in the house. Arson was suspected, but no suspect or motive ever turned up. Nora couldn't help but imagine how alone that boy must have felt, sealed off from safety by 4 walls of flame. The fire station was too far away, and there had been no one inside to help him. When the flames had dwindled to smoke and ash, his body was only semi-recognizable. Large spots of flesh had liquefied, solidifying in uneven patches, while leaving bone exposed in others. Franny wanted so badly to cleanse this house, to cleanse their life as a whole. But Nora was beginning to believe that there was no such thing as a clean start. Their necessary visits to the clinic were a constant reminder of that, and the state of the house was worse. How much dust had they breathed in the last few days? How much of it was the remnants of the poor burned boy? Nora shivered, putting her cigarette out in a handmade ashtray. She could almost hear the kid's voice through the walls. A familiar itch returned. But then there was Franny, floating down the stairs and wrapping Nora in her arms. The world didn't seem so bad anymore. Later that night, Rick's words resurfaced in her mind. His warning about the white lighter. It was ridiculous, insulting even. Someone had died here, and he was trying to blame it on a 99-cent gas station purchase. Nora had lost them more often than chapsticks back when she'd... Nora shook her head vigorously, like a child caught in a lie. She tried to lay down again, but something was pressing into her back. Feeling like the Princess and the Pea, she turned over, lifting up her sleeping bag. The white lighter had found its way back to her. Nora clicked it open. The small flame was comforting, familiar. She found herself bringing her fingertip to the heat, just above the fluttering flame. She brought it down. She winced in pain, pulling the now bright red flesh away from the lighter. She paused, reminding herself that was what withdrawal felt like. Pain unending. She couldn't do that again. Her thumb slipped off the igniter, and the flame winked out. For just an instant, she felt alone in a vacuum, surrounded by disembodied whispers. "Why do you want to hurt yourself?" the voices hissed. Franny nudged Nora in the darkness. Franny asked if she was having a bad night. Nora nodded, embarrassed, even though Franny knew exactly what it felt like. Franny held her until she slept. The white lighter lay in the ground beside Nora's head. As she closed her eyes, she could have sworn she saw it spark on its own. Coming up, temptation takes on a new form. Now back to the story. Nora and Franny's new house was more of a ruin than it was a fully functioning building. Nora had found a white disposable lighter beneath her sleeping bag the first night on the property. She thought little of it until their neighbor Rick told her the rumor that victims of tragic deaths like Jim Morrison and Kurt Cobain were found with white lighters in their hands or pockets. She'd refrained from using it to light her cigarette for his benefit, even though lighting it on the stove once he'd gone seemed more unsafe than any curse. Nora had a hard time believing that the use of one particular lighter meant anything. She found herself holding it at night, trying to keep herself from falling back into her own Cobain-adjacent bad habits. She spent the next day peeking out of the windows, waiting for Rick to pass by. Nora had several questions she wanted answered about the house's past, and Rick was as close to a primary source as she could find. Near sunset, she caught him walking by, checking his Fitbit every few steps. She dropped her wallpaper scraper and stepped out onto the porch. The sky looked like it was burning, deep orange dripping into a softer yellow. Fittingly, the heat was still overwhelming. Rick looked nervous today, shooting looks behind her to the house. He congratulated Nora on surviving the night, patting himself on the back for his hot tip. Nora told him to give it a rest. His tip hadn't saved her. There was no rescue needed. Rick asked if she'd used the lighter, an irritating smugness in his tone. Annoyed, Nora plucked a cigarette from the pack in her back pocket. She put it between her lips. Then she removed the white lighter from her other pocket and used it to light the cancer stick. She smiled at him, blowing smoke up into the sky. Now they just have to see which one of them was right. Rick looked devastated. He asked her why she wanted to hurt herself. Nora's expression hardened, jaw set tightly. She rubbed her sleeves self-consciously, knowing how many needle tracks were concealed beneath. He didn't know what he was saying, she told herself. He was just an old man with misplaced fatherly instincts. Nora decided she could find a less panicky town gossip to answer her questions. She thanked him for livening up her evening and headed back inside. Franny was coughing behind her painter's mask. She asked Nora if she could give the living room a once-over with a vacuum to give her a bit of relief. Nora nodded, glad to have a task. She plugged the vacuum into one of the few working wall sockets and started to suck up the ash and dust. Franny gave Nora a grateful thumbs up and blew her a kiss through the mask before disappearing into the half bathroom again. Nora pushed the machine around the floor. There was a soft crackling behind her, barely audible over the loud hum of the vacuum. She called out to Franny. When she didn't get an answer, she looked up from the floor to discover the half bath was empty. Nora turned the vacuum off. She called out to Franny again. A muffled sound answered from upstairs. She was probably just starting on the second-floor bathroom. The crackling sound had disappeared. Nora shrugged and turned the vacuum back on. Old houses made noises, and this house had been around for at least 60 years. It had character. Suddenly, the soft whisper of late 1960s keyboards wafted down from upstairs. Jim Morrison's unearthly voice echoed in the hollowed-out space. "Come on, baby, and light my fire." Nora couldn't help but smile. calling Franny a troll before dragging the vacuum in the front corner of what would eventually be their living room. But then she felt an odd pain against her right thigh. Burning. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the white lighter. The pale plastic was cool in Nora's hand, and the pain dissipated as quickly as it had come. She shoved the lighter back into her pocket, bobbed her head to light my fire for a few moments, then got back to work, telling herself she was just tired. The music drifted down still, and our love become a funeral pyre, Morrison crooned. Nora heard the crackling again. Sweat dripped down her face. She could still hear their window AC unit blaring away. It shouldn't be that hot in here. The crackling was loud enough to hear over the vacuum and the music now. Nora turned to investigate, only to find flames consuming the wall behind her. The surface warped, slowly bubbling, exposing the new plaster they'd just put in. It fell away, revealing the poor building's tortured innards. Sparks trailed up the exposed wires, curving towards the sections of the wall that remained. One of the wires hit a stray piece of wallpaper. It ignited like kindling. Fire climbed up the wall. Nora yelled for Franny to get out of the house, but she didn't hear anything upstairs. She screamed for her wife, but there was no answer. Nora took a step toward the doorway, but flames were already crawling from the first wall to the next. She was still screaming when Franny finally arrived. Nora begged her to get out of the house and go to safety. Franny stared at Nora in silence for what felt like hours. And then she asked a question, voice shaking with concern. What fire? And just like that, the flames were gone. The living room was whole again. The vacuum sat idle on the floor, still whirring in place. Nora opened and closed her mouth uselessly. She couldn't bear to see the look on Franny's face. The concern. The disappointment. And then she asked the one question Nora didn't want to answer. Was she using again? The more Nora denied it, the more dishonest she felt. She knew she hadn't. She'd only played with the lighter, only remembered what it felt like, the bliss and the fall. But she also knew she'd seen the living room collapse in flames. Franny brought Nora into her arms, squeezing her tightly, begging her to tell her, to be honest with herself. Nora swore and promised she was clean. Franny called the clinic to set up a consult and suggested they go to bed. Nora's poor wife was snoring almost the moment her head hit the pillow, but Nora sat awake. She'd held on to the lighter this time, not wanting to give it any opportunity to surprise her. She told herself she was being ridiculous. But then she saw her heroin kit in a corner of the room. Nora had to catch herself from gasping aloud. She clamped her hands over her mouth, eyes darting from corner to corner, trying to understand. She'd thrown it away. She'd thrown it away months ago. She was clean. She was clean. She glanced at Franny to make sure she was asleep, then approached the small lunchbox like a bomb. It looked exactly the way that she left it, dinged up, a little singed. She didn't dare open it, but she knew what was in there. Matches to light, powder in a bag, a spoon, cotton balls, needles. She reached for the handle, trying to think of a place to dispose of it without anyone seeing. But as her hand searched for the metal bar in the half-light, she saw another object instead. The white lighter, out of her pocket, lying on the ground just before the box. Nora blinked, even more confused than she'd been. Then, the lighter sparked. A tiny flame appeared on the wooden floor. Then, it became several. The next morning, Franny awoke, surprised to find she was alone. A horrible smell filled her nostrils. Her senses sharpened as she realized what it was. Burned meat. She jumped to her feet, adrenaline filling her limbs with energy, ready to run if there was a fire. But there wasn't. There was only Nora. Or rather, what was left of her. She lay in the corner, skin distorted into a charcoal black. Only a few strands of hair were left on her scalp, and what remained of her eyes stared out in terror. Staring right at where Franny had been lying the whole night. Somehow, there was no sign of fire anywhere else around the body. The floorboards and walls were clean. Franny fell to Nora's side, sobbing. In between Nora's fingers was a flash of white plastic. The lighter, polished and ready to be used again. The legend of the white lighter has several issues when it comes to authenticity. For one, white disposable Bic lighters weren't even manufactured until 1973, a full 2 years after the loss of Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin. The only disposable lighter brand that existed at the time was the Cricket, which had been on the French market since 1961, but didn't cross the Atlantic until the company was purchased by Gillette in 1972. So only one member of the early 27 Club trio, Jim Morrison, had any chance of coming into contact with the disposable lighter before he was found dead in his Paris flat. But Morrison died in his bathtub, and there are no records of him possessing any smoking accessories that match the white lighter's description. Kurt Cobain would have had access to Bic lighters when he died by suicide in 1994. Crime scene photos from the Seattle Police Department indicate that he had 2 lighters near him on the day of his death. However, neither was white. In order to fully understand the white lighter legend, one needs to understand the mythology of the 27 Club itself. Within 10 months, from 1970 to 1971, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison passed away. Hendrix took as many as 9 sleeping pills while drunk and high on amphetamines and barbiturates before choking on his own vomit. Joplin collapsed after a heroin overdose, hitting her head on a table on the way down. Jim Morrison died of congestive heart failure, but the chemicals potentially involved in his death have never been fully confirmed because French law did not require an autopsy. All 3 musicians came from a tradition of psychedelic rock, and at the time their drug use wasn't framed as particularly out of the ordinary. The compound nature of the loss suggested a meaningful trend, and many fans and friends didn't want the blame to fall on the artist's addictions. The supernatural rumors grew as a result, particularly surrounding the performer's shared age. Kurt Cobain fits into this tragic narrative for the same reason Morrison does. Like Morrison, Cobain was a poet who struggled with addiction, and his legend has only grown since he shot himself in 1994. In many ways, we want suicide and addiction to be mysterious, a kind of psychological alchemy that absolves society of blame. There's no mental health crisis, no alienation and lack of support and accountability. For many, it's far more comforting to believe in a cursed lighter rather than examine the role society plays in addiction and mental illness. High-profile suicides and overdoses, like those of Hendrix, Joplin, Morrison, and Cobain, expose how alone those who struggle with substance abuse and suicidal ideation can become as a result of social taboos and institutional breakdowns. Perhaps a reason the white lighter legend is so popular is due to a connection with Morrison's poetry. Morrison filled his work with vivid fire imagery. His writing suggests both the destructive power and fascination flames can have, hinting at secrets he would not share in life, an unseen world where fate and magic work hand in hand. To quote his poem, The Opening of the Trunk, I'm talking to you, myself. Let's recreate the world. The palace of conception is burning. Look, see it burn. Bask in the warm, hot coals. You're too young to be old. You don't need to be told. You want to see things as they are. You know exactly what I do. Everything. Society seems to have missed the message in the ash. The forces that lead to addiction, to overdose, and the failure to treat mental illness are slippery and often ignored. If we see them, we are hesitant to name them. Thanks again for tuning into Haunted Places. We'll be back on Thursday with a new episode. And don't forget to come back on Tuesday for our Urban Legends series, available only on Spotify. You can find more episodes of Haunted Places and all other Parcast originals for free on Spotify. Not only does Spotify already have all your favorite music, but now Spotify is making it easy for you to enjoy all your favorite Parcast originals, like Haunted Places, for free, from your phone, desktop, or smart speaker. To stream Haunted Places on Spotify, just open the app and type Haunted Places in the search bar. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Parcast and Twitter at Parcast Network. Until next time, don't believe some of the things you hear. Believe all of them. Haunted Places was created by Max Cutler and is a Parcast Studios original. Executive producers include Max and Ron Cutler. Sound design by Kenny Hobbs, with production assistance by Ron Shapiro, Carly Madden, Aaron Larson, and Paul Mahler. This episode of Haunted Places was written by Lildy Ritter and Jennifer Richey, with writing assistance by Greg Castro. I'm Greg Polson.